They all laughed at the grandson for inheriting the old cabin until he found what his grandfather hid. "Are you actually going to keep that pile of rotting wood, Daniel?" Marcus leaned back, a smug grin plastered across his face as the lawyer handed over the deed. "I get the penthouse, Sarah gets the trust fund, and you get a termite sanctuary." It's poetic, really. The mahogany room echoed with the sharp chuckles of the family. Daniel stared at the yellowed paper in his hands, his knuckles turning white. He didn't care about the millions. He cared about the man who had just passed away. "I'm keeping it," Daniel said quietly, his voice cutting through their endless amusement. "He left it to me for a reason." And he was about to find out exactly why. The rain was coming down in thick grey sheets by the time Daniel's ancient pickup truck finally crested the mountain ridge. The windshield wipers slapped back and forth with a rhythmic, frantic squeak, struggling to clear the deluge that blurred the winding dirt road ahead. The drive from the towering glass and steel metropolis of the city to the dense, unforgiving wilderness of the northern pines felt like a transition between two completely different worlds. In the city, the reading of the will had been a sterile, calculated affair, dominated by the sharp clinking of designer coffee cups and the rustling of legal documents. Here, there was only the sound of nature reclaiming its territory, relentless and raw. Daniel gripped the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. The memory of his family's mocking laughter still burned in his ears, a venomous echo that the drumming rain could not completely wash away. Marcus, with his tailored Italian suits and slicked-back hair, had always viewed their grandfather as a bank account waiting to mature. Sarah, practically vibrating with entitlement, had spent the entire memorial service quietly complaining about the lack of cellular reception at the church. They had walked away from the lawyer's office as millionaires, flush with liquid assets, stock portfolios, and prime real estate. Daniel, the quiet grandson, who had spent his summers covered in sawdust and engine grease alongside the old man, had been handed the deed to a 100-year-old hunting cabin at the edge of nowhere. To the rest of the family, it was a final, undeniable insult. A confirmation of Daniel's status as the black sheep, the unambitious mechanic who would never amount to anything. But Daniel knew Arthur better than that. His grandfather was a man of quiet deliberation, a man who never made a move without a meticulously calculated reason. The headlights of the truck cut through the thick gloom, finally illuminating the structure at the end of the overgrown driveway. Daniel shifted the truck into park, killing the engine. The sudden silence inside the cab was deafening. He sat there for a long moment, simply staring through the rain-streaked glass. The cabin was in far worse shape than he remembered. It sat slumped against a backdrop of towering, shadow-drenched pines, looking less like a home and more like the skeletal remains of a forgotten beast. The roof sagged heavily in the middle, missing dozens of shingles that had been stripped away by years of brutal winter storms. The front porch, where Daniel and Arthur used to sit for hours in companionable silence, was severely warped, the wooden planks rotting and covered in a thick, slick layer of green moss. It looked entirely uninhabitable, a monument to decay. Steeling himself, Daniel zipped up his faded canvas work jacket, pushed open the heavy door of the truck, and stepped out into the freezing downpour. His boots sank instantly into the thick, freezing mud. As he walked toward the structure, the sheer scale of the dilapidation became overwhelmingly apparent. Weeds grew as high as his waist, choking the stone pathway. The windows were opaque with decades of grime, and one was completely shattered, patched haphazardly with a piece of waterlogged cardboard. When he stepped onto the porch, the wood groaned ominously beneath his weight, a sharp, cracking sound that made him freeze. He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the heavy, iron key the lawyer had given him. It felt cold and alien in his palm. Unlocking the front door required a forceful shove, his shoulder slamming against the warped wood until the swollen frame finally gave way with a screech of rusted hinges. The smell hit him the second he crossed the threshold, a suffocating, heavy cocktail of mildew, stale air, damp wood, and something faintly metallic. He flicked the light switch on the wall out of pure habit, but as expected, the cabin remained engulfed in shadows. The power had undoubtedly been shut off for years. Pulling a heavy-duty flashlight from his jacket pocket, he clicked it on, sending a blinding white beam cutting through the dense, swirling dust motes in the air. The interior was a disaster of neglect. The living room was cluttered with ruined, water-damaged furniture. A dilapidated sofa sat in the center of the room, its floral fabric shredded by what looked like generations of field mice. Old newspapers, yellowed and crisp with age, were stacked precariously in the corners, crumbling into dust at the edges. Cobwebs hung from the exposed ceiling beams like thick, grey curtains. As Daniel moved the beam of his flashlight slowly across the room, an overwhelming sense of grief suddenly washed over him, hitting him so hard he had to lean against the door frame to steady himself. This wasn't just a rotting building. This was the physical manifestation of his grandfather's absence. The man who had seemed larger than life, invincible, was truly gone, leaving behind only this decaying shell. He walked slowly toward the stone fireplace, the floorboards screaming under his boots. On the mantel, thick with dust, sat a single framed photograph. It was a picture of Daniel at 10 years old, grinning widely, holding up a tiny, pathetic sunfish while Arthur knelt beside him, his calloused hand resting proudly on Daniel's shoulder. Arthur's face was weathered, his eyes crinkling at the corners with genuine, unrestrained joy. Daniel reached out, his thumb gently wiping the thick layer of grime from the glass. His chest tightened, a painful knot forming in his throat. "Why did you leave me this, Grandpa?" he whispered into the empty, cold room. "What am I supposed to do with a rotting tomb?" The cabin offered no answers. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose window panes, mimicking the mocking laughter of his cousins. The reality of his inheritance settled heavily onto his shoulders. He had no money to renovate this place, and selling it in this condition would barely yield enough to cover the property taxes. For the first time since the reading of the will, a dark, creeping seed of doubt began to take root in Daniel's mind. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe the old man had just lost his mind in his final years. Maybe there was no grand design, no hidden lesson. Maybe he had just been handed a pile of worthless, rotting wood, a final burden to carry alone. Exhausted, freezing and heartbroken, Daniel pulled a heavy tarp over the ruined sofa, lay down in the freezing darkness, and listened to the rain tear at the roof, dreading the brutal morning light. The morning sun did nothing to improve the cabin's grim aesthetics. If anything, the harsh daylight only magnified the absolute ruin of the place. Daniel woke up freezing, his muscles cramping from a night spent shivering on the damp, ruined sofa under his canvas jacket. The air inside the cabin was thick and frigid, smelling sharply of wet earth and ancient pine. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and looked around the room. In the daylight, the layers of dust seemed thicker, the water stains on the ceiling more pronounced, spreading outward like dark, ugly bruises. He pulled his phone from his pocket. No service. He was completely isolated. With a heavy sigh, he pushed himself up, his joints popping in protest, and decided there was only one way to deal with the overwhelming anxiety knotting his stomach. Manual labor. Daniel found a rusted wheelbarrow behind the cabin and a push broom with half its bristles missing in the small utility closet. For the next 8 hours, he engaged in a brutal, thoughtless war against the decay. He started with the living room, tossing the shredded sofa cushions, the gnawed newspapers, and the splintered remnants of a coffee table out onto the front lawn. The physical exertion was excruciating but welcome. It kept his mind from drifting back to the lawyer's office, from Marcus's sneering face and Sarah's exasperated sighs. By mid-afternoon, his hands were raw and blistered, his back screaming in agony with every bend and lift. He had ripped up the rotting, mildewed carpet, exposing the wide plank hardwood floors underneath. The wood was scuffed and stained, but it was solid oak. It was the first sign of resilience he had found in the entire structure. Around 4 o'clock, he took a break, collapsing onto the edge of the fireplace hearth, wiping a thick layer of sweat and grime from his forehead with the back of his dirty sleeve. He opened a bottle of water he had brought in his truck and drained half of it in one long, desperate gulp. As he sat there, catching his breath in the quiet emptiness of the room, his eyes began to wander across the newly exposed hardwood floor. The sunlight was streaming through the grime-covered window at a sharp, low angle, casting long, elongated shadows across the oak planks. Daniel frowned, leaning forward slightly, his eyes narrowing, as he noticed something odd. The dust motes dancing in the shaft of sunlight weren't just settling on the floor. They were swirling, being pushed by a very faint, almost imperceptible current of air coming from the ground. He set his water bottle down on the stone hearth and walked slowly toward the center of the room. He crouched down, hovering his bare, blistered hand inches above the hardwood. He felt it, a distinct, steady draft of cool, dry air slicing up through a microscopic gap between two of the floorboards. It didn't make sense. The cabin was built on a solid concrete foundation pad. There shouldn't be a draft coming from beneath the floor. Daniel's mechanical mind, honed by years of taking engines apart and putting them back together, immediately sparked to life. He tapped the floorboards with his knuckles. The wood near the walls gave a dull, solid thud. But when he tapped the boards in the exact center of the room, right where the draft was escaping, the sound changed. It was a hollow, resonant echo. Adrenaline began to pump through his veins, pushing away the exhaustion. He hurried out to his truck and grabbed his heavy steel crowbar and a claw hammer from his toolbox. Returning to the living room, he knelt beside the hollow-sounding boards. He wedged the flat edge of the crowbar into the thin seam between the planks and applied pressure. At first, nothing happened. The wood groaned but held fast. He adjusted his grip, putting his back into it, leveraging his entire body weight against the steel bar. With a sudden, sharp crack, the floorboard gave way, lifting upward. But it didn't splinter. Instead, a perfectly rectangular section of the floor, measuring roughly 3 feet by 3 feet, popped up in one solid, seamless piece. Daniel gasped, dropping the crowbar. The section of floor wasn't nailed down. It was a heavily reinforced, perfectly camouflaged trapdoor, set flush against the surrounding planks with an astonishing level of craftsmanship. It was so perfectly joined that the seams were virtually invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. With trembling, blistered hands, he grabbed the edges of the heavy wooden square and hoisted it completely open, flipping it back onto the floor. A rush of remarkably cool, incredibly dry air instantly billowed up into his face, carrying with it a scent that was entirely out of place in the rotting cabin. The sharp, clean smell of machine oil, brass polish, and aged leather. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight from the mantel and walked back to the gaping, black hole in the floor. He clicked the beam on, shining it downward. Instead of dirt or a cracked concrete foundation, the brilliant white light illuminated a set of steep, impeccably constructed steel stairs descending into pitch darkness. The handrail alongside the stairs was made of polished brass, gleaming even in the dim light. Daniel's heart began to hammer violently against his ribs. He had spent countless summers in this cabin, running across these very floorboards, and he had never, not once, suspected that anything lay beneath them. Arthur had never mentioned a basement. He had never even hinted at it. The fear and doubt from the previous night evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming electric wave of anticipation. "What were you hiding, old man?" Daniel whispered into the dark abyss. He didn't wait for an answer. Gripping the cold, polished brass handrail, he placed his boot on the first steel step. It didn't creak. It felt as solid as a bank vault. Slowly, carefully, Daniel descended into the darkness, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the black, revealing nothing but the stairs until his boots finally hit a solid, polished concrete floor. He swept the flashlight around the dark space. His beam caught the edge of a large metal electrical panel on the wall to his left. He walked over, his breath hitching in his throat, and reached for the heavy main breaker switch. With a loud, echoing clack, he threw the lever upward. Instantly, the underground room flooded with brilliant, blinding light. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut against the sudden, piercing glare. When he finally opened them, adjusting to the brilliant illumination, his jaw dropped in absolute, paralyzed shock. He was not standing in a dusty, forgotten root cellar. He was standing in a sprawling, climate-controlled, state-of-the-art workshop that looked like a cross between a high-tech laboratory and a museum vault. The room was massive, easily extending beneath the entire footprint of the cabin above, and it was immaculately clean. The air was perfectly dry, humming with the quiet, steady whir of a heavy-duty dehumidification and ventilation system built seamlessly into the walls. The contrast between the rotting, dying structure above ground and this pristine, technological sanctuary was so jarring that Daniel felt dizzy, his mind struggling to reconcile the two realities. Along the far wall stretched a series of heavy, solid walnut workbenches. Above them, rows of brilliant, articulating LED magnifying lamps were mounted securely to the wall. The benches themselves were covered in tools, but not the wrenches and heavy hammers Daniel was used to seeing his grandfather use on old tractors. These were impossibly delicate, microscopic instruments. There were rows of precision brass tweezers, tiny diamond-tipped lathes, jewelers' loops, microscopic screwdrivers, and hundreds of small, clear glass vials filled with gears no larger than a grain of sand. This was not the workshop of a hobbyist mechanic. This was the sanctuary of a master horologist. Slowly, as if moving through a dream, Daniel walked toward the central workbench. Sitting perfectly in the center, resting on a square of black velvet, was a pocket watch. But it wasn't just any watch. It was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. The casing was crafted from heavy, unpolished rose gold. The face was completely transparent, made of pure sapphire crystal, revealing a dizzying, impossibly complex labyrinth of microscopic, interlocking gears, tourbillons, and delicate balance springs, all moving in perfect, silent harmony. It was alive, ticking with a faint, rhythmic heartbeat. Next to the watch lay a thick, leather-bound ledger. Daniel's trembling hands reached out, brushing the dust-free cover of the ledger before gently flipping it open. The pages were filled with his grandfather's elegant, precise handwriting. It wasn't a diary. It was a record of sales. He ran his calloused finger down the first column of dates, names, and numbers. His breath caught sharply in his throat. The names listed were global titans, monarchs, eccentric billionaires, legendary art collectors, foreign dignitaries. Next to each name was a description of a bespoke, handcrafted timepiece, and next to that, a price. The numbers were staggering: 7 figures, 8 figures. Some transactions were simply marked as exchanged for property deed or gold bullion secured. Daniel flipped wildly through the pages. The ledger spanned over 40 years. Arthur hadn't been a simple, retired auto mechanic living on a modest pension. Under the pseudonym A. Pendleton, he was apparently one of the most exclusive, secretive, and highly sought-after master watchmakers on the planet. He had been creating mechanical masterpieces for the global elite, quietly amassing a fortune that made Marcus's trust fund and penthouse look like pocket change. And he had hidden it all beneath the rotting floorboards of a decrepit cabin in the woods. Tucked into the very back cover of the thick ledger was a heavy, cream-colored envelope, sealed with red wax. Daniel carefully broke the seal, pulling out a single sheet of stationery. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Daniel," it began. "If you are reading this, it means you didn't sell the cabin to the first developer who made you an offer. It means you chose to stay, to look deeper, and to do the hard work. I always knew you were the only one who would. Your cousins, Marcus and Sarah, they only understand value if it has a price tag attached to it immediately. They look at the world and see only what they can take from it. But you, Daniel, you look at a broken engine and see what it can become with patience and care. You look at a rotting cabin and see the memories we built there." Daniel's vision blurred as tears finally spilled over his eyelashes, tracing hot lines through the dirt on his cheeks. "I gave them the money. Let them have the stocks and the properties. It will rot their character faster than the rain rots wood. True wealth isn't liquid cash handed to you by a lawyer. True wealth is craftsmanship, legacy, and the patience to build something that outlasts you. In the 3 heavy steel safes against the back wall, you will find my final, unsold collection. 12 pieces. They are yours. The blueprints, the patents for my escapement mechanisms, the tools, they are all yours. Do not sell them immediately. Learn the trade. The workshop is fully self-sustaining. I have left you not just a fortune, but a purpose. I love you, my boy. Time is our most valuable asset. Spend it building something real. Grandpa." Daniel lowered the letter, his chest heaving with deep, ragged sobs. He looked up at the 3 massive, combination-locked steel safes standing silently against the far concrete wall. He wasn't the outcast. He wasn't the black sheep who had been left with nothing. He was the chosen heir to an empire of time, the only one deemed worthy of his grandfather's true life's work. He gently placed the letter back on the velvet pad, right next to the ticking masterpiece. He wiped his face with his dirty sleeve, his jaw setting with a new, unbreakable resolve. He had work to do. 2 weeks later, the silence of the mountain was violently shattered by the low, aggressive roar of a high-end sports car grinding its way up the dirt driveway. Daniel was on the front porch, nursing a cup of black coffee, calmly watching as Marcus's silver Porsche Panamera carefully navigated the deep, mud-filled ruts. The car finally came to a halt near Daniel's rusty truck, looking absurdly out of place against the backdrop of the wilderness. The driver's door opened, and Marcus stepped out, wearing a pristine cashmere overcoat, his expensive Italian leather shoes immediately sinking into the damp earth. Sarah emerged from the passenger side, pulling her designer scarf tightly around her neck, looking at the cabin with an expression of profound, theatrical disgust. "Daniel!" Marcus called out, a wide, artificial smile plastered on his face as he picked his way carefully toward the porch. "Look at this place. Still standing, I see. Barely." Daniel took a slow sip of his coffee, his expression completely unreadable. He hadn't changed into fancy clothes. He was still wearing his faded work jeans and his heavy canvas jacket, his hands heavily calloused and permanently stained with a faint trace of machine oil. "What do you want, Marcus?" he asked, his voice calm, devoid of the anger that had consumed him in the lawyer's office. Sarah reached the porch, refusing to step onto the rotting wood. "We came to do you a favor, Danny," she said, her tone dripping with condescending pity. "We know you're struggling. This place is a hazard. The property taxes alone are going to bankrupt you." Marcus stepped up beside her, pulling a crisp, folded legal document from the inner pocket of his coat. "I have a contact at a commercial development firm in the city. They're looking to buy up tracts of land out here for a luxury wilderness retreat. They don't care about the structure, just the acreage. I negotiated a deal for you." He held out the paper, his smile widening into something predatory. $75,000. Cash. You sign the deed over to them, and you walk away free and clear. You can finally afford to fix up that awful truck of yours. Daniel looked at the paper fluttering in Marcus's manicured hand, then looked up into his cousin's arrogant eyes. 2 weeks ago, that offer would have felt like a massive, life-saving windfall. Today, it was an insult so insignificant it was almost comical. Daniel didn't reach for the paper. Instead, he reached into the deep pocket of his canvas jacket and slowly pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in a pristine black velvet cloth. "I'm not selling the land, Marcus," Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying an absolute, unshakable authority. Marcus scoffed, letting his arm drop. "Don't be an idiot, Daniel. Pride isn't going to pay your heating bill. Look at yourself. Look at this. This garbage heap. Grandad left you a joke. Accept the punchline and take the money." "He didn't leave me a joke," Daniel replied, stepping forward. He slowly peeled back the layers of black velvet in his palm. The morning sunlight hit the heavy rose-gold casing of the pocket watch, refracting off the pure sapphire crystal face. The intricate, impossible labyrinth of internal gears sparkled brilliantly, ticking with a heavy, powerful, and relentless rhythm. It was a beautiful, mesmerizing piece of engineering, radiating an aura of immense, undeniable value. Marcus stopped talking, his eyes locked onto the timepiece, his smug smile instantly melting away into a look of sheer, confused disbelief. Sarah gasped quietly, stepping closer, her eyes wide as she took in the impossible craftsmanship. Even they, with their superficial understanding of the world, could recognize that they were looking at something extraordinarily rare. What is that?" Marcus stammered, his voice suddenly sounding very small, very fragile in the open mountain air. "This," Daniel said, his voice steady and calm, "is one of 12 pieces. It's an original A. Pendleton, grandfather's pseudonym." Daniel reached into his other pocket and pulled out a certified appraisal document he had acquired from the world's leading horology auction house just 3 days prior. He unfolded it and handed it to Marcus. Marcus snatched the paper, his eyes scanning the lines rapidly. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. His hands began to shake violently. 3.2 million, he whispered, choking on the number. "For one watch? There are 11 more in the vault downstairs," Daniel said simply, slipping the watch back into his pocket, along with his blueprints, his patents, and his entire workshop. "He didn't leave me a rotting cabin, Marcus. He left me his legacy. He left you the cash because he knew you'd blow it on cars and penthouses. He knew you had no patience. He left this to me because he knew I'd actually do the work." Sarah stared at Daniel, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, the crushing weight of their grandfather's judgment finally crashing down upon her. They had taken the easy road, celebrating their sudden wealth, completely oblivious to the fact that they had been tested and found entirely lacking. They were rich, but they were empty. Daniel had inherited the true empire. "You can leave now," Daniel said, turning his back on them and walking toward the front door. "I have work to do. The workshop is waiting." He didn't look back as he stepped inside, the heavy door closing with a solid, resounding thud, leaving his cousins standing in the mud, staring at the rotting cabin that held a fortune they could never, ever touch. True value is rarely found on the surface. It is hidden in the quiet corners of patience, loyalty, and love. Daniel's grandfather knew that wealth without character is just empty paper, but a legacy built on passion and entrusted to the right heart is truly timeless. Sometimes, the greatest treasures in our lives are disguised as our heaviest burdens, waiting for someone willing to do the hard work to uncover them. If you enjoyed this cinematic story of hidden truth and rightful inheritance, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who appreciates a great twist, and subscribe to our channel for more immersive, real-life stories.